I'm a PhD student here at the Champollion Foundation. I also happen to be your host for tonight's event. Now, before I go any further, I'd like to do two things. Firstly, I'd like to take the time out to actually thank you for joining us. We know you could be otherwise occupied, you could be watching the football game, or you could even be on vacation, whether physically or mentally. So we really want to say that we appreciate you being here. The second thing I would like to do is to officially welcome you to tonight's event where we will be unpacking bias. And we will be doing this using perspectives from neuroscience and social psychology. Now, I want to let you know that we would love for you to be here in person with us, but we understand and know why this cannot happen. Nonetheless, we want this event to be as inclusive as possible. And in order to do that, what we have is a few lines of communication which we can interact. So we have Facebook, where you can use the Facebook comments. You also have YouTube, where you can use the comments. And also on Zoom webinar, where you can use the chats. At this moment, actually, I'd also like to let you know that we'll be launching a poll. I know some of you may have already done this poll if you registered through the website, but we're launching it now so that others who may not have taken part in it could do so. We really want to see the answers to these questions. They will be important for us later. Now that we got these orders of business over with, I know that I have to do the introduction for you. And so I want to slip into my professional presenter mode. So give me a second as I do this. Now, I know people like riddles, so I'll attempt a shameless attention grab by asking you to solve one with me. The riddle goes like this. A father and his son are driving one day during a thunderstorm. The wheel of the car hits a pool of water and hydroplanes, causing the father to lose control of the vehicle and crash. Luckily, a good Samaritan on the scene was able to call the paramedics, but before they could arrive, the father succumbed to his injuries and unfortunately died. This story, however, has a glimmer of hope. Upon arrival, the paramedics declared the son could survive if he received immediate medical attention. Showing the meaning of haste, they rushed him to the hospital and prepared him for surgery. At the hospital, the surgeon walks in and says, "I cannot perform surgery on him. He is my son." How could this be? I'll give you a few seconds to come up with the answer. The answer is the surgeon is the boy's mother. Unlike Romance languages such as Portuguese, English is gender neutral. Thus, there is no a priori reason for us to associate the word surgeon with a particular gender. Yet, we implicitly associate surgeons with men. Now, if you did not get the answer, do not be ashamed or even alarmed. In a study with 144 students, only 33% of them were able to provide the correct answer. And I will be a snitch and tell you, in our group organizing this event, at least one person was unable to solve the riddle. Overall, it takes us double the time to solve a gender stereotype inconsistent riddle than one which conforms with the stereotype. This happens because through experience, we form associations between gender and particular roles, duties, and attributes. More generally, through life, the brain forms all sorts of associations as it learns the statistics of our environment. These associations, when left unchecked, can lay the foundation for the formation of biases. This now brings me to our next point. What is bias? Before I get to the formal definition, I want to share a bit of etymology with you. The word bias comes from the French word biais, pardon my French, which means a slant or sloping line. It was introduced in English via the game of bowls, where balls would have a greater weight on one side, causing them to curve when they're rolled. This lies at the root of how we use the word bias today, to signify a one-sided tendency of the mind or undue propensity towards something. It also lies at the root of the image design for tonight's event. For tonight's framing, a bias can be defined as an individual's preconceived and enduring evaluative response towards a particular person, group, or thing. It is preconceived as it does not arise from full or adequate knowledge, and it is enduring as it is relatively stable over time. Further, these evaluative responses typically involve value judgments or the assignment of particular attributes to the object of evaluation. As such, biases may be negative, like softer, worse, slower, weaker, or positive, such as harder, better, faster, stronger. Bias may also be explicit, meaning the individual is more or less aware of them, or they may be implicit, meaning the individual has no or very little conscious awareness of them. This now brings us to the heart of tonight's discussion. So now I will be telling you what I hope to accomplish with the rest of this introduction. The first goal of my introduction tonight was to actually define bias. I think I have accomplished this with some help from the little trick with my riddle to grab your attention. Next, I'd like to highlight that biases are found across many social spheres. Following this, I would like to highlight the effects of bias on the individuals who are subjected to them. And then I will go on to state how scientists try to measure bias using a specific study for implicit bias. Finally, I'll walk you through tonight's program. Speaking of walking, let me engage you with another story. On a fine pre-COVID night, after a night out in Lisbon Spring Street, I was making my way home. The street was a bit quiet, dark, and secluded, but I noticed that someone was walking towards me. Now, my parents did not teach me not to talk to strangers, so my brain was stirring to find some comment I could make so we could share a laugh and ease awkwardness as we crossed paths. As you may have noticed by now, I am a Black man. So this is something I tend to think of when I'm in these circumstances. Anyway, as the individual and I came closer, I was able to see that he was a tall, heavily built Black man. Done with its stirring, my brain came up with a peculiar idea, which was to cross the road because I am a skinny Black man. And so I did. Now, I beg of you not to judge me too harshly with this story, because after all, I am ashamed of it. I share the story in all my vulnerability to highlight 2 points. The first is, as you may know, biases span many social spheres. The riddle presented earlier dealt with the concept of gender bias, while the story I just told you was concerned with racial bias. While these are typically the forms of biases people think about, bias exists as it relates to age, religion, sexual identity, socioeconomic status, health status, and many more categories. The second thing I want to address is the group dynamics underlying bias. People typically think of bias within the framework of out-group bias, where an individual from one social group directs bias towards a person of another social group, such as a man being biased towards a woman. However, my story seeks to highlight that bias can also be directed towards individuals who are members of the same social group, termed in-group bias. In the case of my story, where we were both Black men. I'll also share with you that the member of our organizing team who could not solve the gender riddle on initial exposure is a woman, which is another example of in-group bias. So I think a small but very important point can be made here. Even people who care deeply about these issues can possess biased views and attitudes. Now let me go back to the story. As I continued my journey home, a sense of guilt and shame came over me. I started thinking of how this individual may have felt being subject to racial profiling by a member of his own race. I also thought about how I felt when I was in his shoes, as I have also been subjected to similar experiences. This brings me to the second reason I'm telling this story, to highlight the impact bias has on those it is directed towards. I suspect many, if not all of us, have been subject to what we perceive as biased behavior, termed discrimination. Hence, we may be familiar with the feelings of anger, sadness, or shame these experiences bring about. However, because this biased behavior tends to be consistently directed towards disadvantaged or minority groups, its effects can be far more pernicious or even deadly. If I were to go through the numerous studies documenting the effect of bias on individuals across the various aspects of life, this event would go on far longer than any of us would be comfortable sitting through. As such, I will briefly go through a select few. Numerous studies have shown that bias can be a threat to someone's livelihood, as it can create inequalities in hiring opportunities. A common tool to measure the influence of bias within the employment sector is the correspondence field study. In these experiments, fake job applications differing only in some variable of interest are sent out in response to real job openings. Employer responses are then measured, allowing the researcher to make causal inferences between the employer responses and the controlled variable. One such 2016 study conducted in Germany looked at employer response rates as a function of female migrant and religious status. They found that callback rates fell from 18.8% with a native sounding name to 13.5% when changed to one of Turkish origin. Furthermore, they found that having a Turkish name and wearing a headscarf further lowered the callback rates to 4.2%. Note the images used in the CV were all of the same woman. More generally, a study looking at 90 correspondence experiments conducted between 2005 and 2016 found that 78.4% of them reported unfavorable outcomes when applications came from vulnerable or minority groups. Importantly, the pervasiveness of bias in the employment sector was highlighted as the studies spanned 19 countries and encompassed 14 different social groups. Beyond access to jobs, studies have shown that bias can also impact one's access to a home. Here, correspondence studies can be adapted to look at landlord response rates to application from minority groups. For example, a 2019 correspondence study done in Portugal looked at response rates of landlords in Lisbon and Porto as a function of sexual orientation. They found that men in same-sex relationships were less likely to receive a positive response when seeking to rent an apartment compared to women in same-sex relationships or heterosexual couples. It was also shown that they were much less likely to receive an invitation for showing, with a 13% response rate compared to an average of 21% for the other couples. Beyond access to a home, there are also studies looking at the effect of bias on people's attitude towards policing and the justice system. Along these lines, a 2019 study using fictitious stories of criminal sentencing revealed that Portuguese students were more likely to support a conviction if the individual was Black and came from a lower social class compared to if their social class was not revealed. Interestingly, the inverse was true for fictitious white convicts, as the students were less likely to agree with the prison conviction if the individual was revealed to come from a lower social class. Finally, studies have also documented the impact of bias on people's health. As an example, a longitudinal study conducted in the US from 2004 to 2006 found that African Americans experienced higher levels of persistent discrimination and also had higher levels of dysfunction across multiple systems of the body. Further, the study found that higher levels of persistent discrimination was correlated with higher levels of system dysfunctions regardless of races. This holds true even when adjusting their analysis for variables such as demographics, socioeconomic status, medication, health behaviors, and personality. As I mentioned earlier, the literature concerned with the impact of bias on individuals' lives is vast. So I'll pause the examples here. However, given its well-documented impact, and I hope you trust me on this, looking at steps to address it seems like the natural course of action. As scientists, we know that measuring a variable is useful for assessing the effectiveness of our interventions. This brings me to the penultimate segment of our introduction, where we will be looking at one way to measure bias, specifically implicit bias. As I told you before, I'm not averse to strangers. So I ask for your indulgence once more as I seek to engage you in a game. The aim of the game is straightforward. A word will pop up on the screen, and I'd like you to say the color of the text as fast as you can. We will be displaying the words in English to the left of the screen and Portuguese to the right. So pay attention to the language you're most comfortable with. Let's run a test. As you can see, the color of the text is blue. Hence, you should say blue as fast as you can. Now, with the example given, let's begin the game. And remember, please say the color you see and not the word. And say it as fast as you can. You get brownie points for speed. Okay. I hope you were very quick on the draw saying the color of those texts. Now I'll ask you to do the same thing as before. And remember to say it as fast as you can. And I'm back. I hope you are still saying the color of those words as fast as you can, despite my little trick. Now I'll ask you to do the same thing one last time. One, say the color of the text as it is written, say it as fast as you can, and remember to focus on the side with the language you are most comfortable with. Okay. Thank you very much for your participation. The game you've just played is a variant of a widely used psychological test known as the Stroop test. It was named after John Ridley Stroop, who in 1938 wrote the first English publication on the effect many of you would have just experienced. Specifically, I suspect your response or reaction time was much slower in the third phase of the game, when the color word pairing was incongruent, compared to the two other phases. This effect of a delayed reaction time when processing incongruent information is called the Stroop effect. Note, this effect was also what we spoke about earlier regarding people's slowness in processing gender incongruent stereotypes. So what lies behind the slowness in processing incongruent information? Again, it comes down to our life experiences and the associations our brains make. Growing up, you would have made strong associations between written texts and their meaning. In the example case, making the association between the text and the word green a color. This association would become stronger and stronger as your reading skills developed, thus automatizing it. You would also have learned a mapping between colors and the word representing them. As in this example, you will learn that the color of the circle in the left is called green. In the Stroop test, when the word and colors are congruent, the brain recognizes both as green, causing no need for extra work. However, when the color and the word are incongruent, there is a conflict or interference between the recognized color and the written text. On the one hand, the brain wishes to produce the response it associates with the written text, that is, red, but on the other hand, it knows because of the game's rules, this response is inappropriate, and instead, it should respond with the color of the word, green. Because of this conflict, extra brain areas involved in memory and executive control are recruited to produce the appropriate response. One can liken this to traffic control. When there is no need for a detour, like in the case of congruent stimuli, the traffic authorities do not need to recruit extra resources to keep things in order. However, when there is need to reroute or detour people, the traffic authorities have to recruit extra resources, such as a traffic director or sign to reroute the traffic. Importantly, for the Stroop effect to work, the words must have meaning to the individual. Big reveal. The only difference between phase 2 and phase 3 of the game was the language the words were written in. I suspect most of us don't know Chinese, hence we had no delay in our reaction times. However, for an individual who does, and I know one of them, they would have had delays. This need for the words to have meaning to the reader was leveraged by US intelligence during the Cold War as they administered Stroop tests in Russian to detect Russian spies. By now, you may be wondering what is the relationship between the Stroop test and measuring implicit bias. Well, as I mentioned earlier, the brain seeks to learn all sorts of patterns in the environment, hence forming all sorts of associations. Just as it forms associations between words and colors, so too does it form associations between social concepts and various attributes, even if we are not aware of these associations. Thus, psychologists sought a way to test the strength of these associations, and this effort culminated in a 1998 paper introducing the implicit association test, called IAT for short. The IAT seeks to measure the strength of association between two target concepts and an attribute via the reaction time of individuals. This is all a bit abstract. So to help you get an intuition for the test, I'll be showing you a clip with Dr. Banerjee, one of the original founders of Project Implicit, administering the test to a conference audience. In the clip, she asked the audience to place words corresponding to a career or the name of a man to the left, and words corresponding to the home or the name of a woman to the right. In the example we show, Jessica is a female associated name, so the audience would shout right. Now for the clip.
Let's go. Excellent.
Okay. Now in the next clip I will show you, she has changed the rules of the test by switching the genders. So now the audience has to shout left if the presented word corresponds to a career or the name of a woman, and right if it corresponds to the home or the name of a man. Our example again is the name Jessica, but now it goes to the left. Here you can make your bets with your colleagues or even your pets to see what will happen next.
Go fast, go loud, go.
As you can see, a Stroop effect was observed as the audience was slower when the concept attribute pairing was inconsistent with the gender stereotype. That is, the result suggests the audience had a weaker association between male and the home and female and careers. This brings us full circle to the beginning of the presentation, highlighting the difficulties we have processing information that does not conform to our biases. So, we have looked at the definition and nature of bias, the impact it has on individuals subjected to it, and how we measure it in its implicit form. I hope I have done a good job in impressing upon you the importance of this subject, and as such, convinced you that discussing, studying, and addressing it are worthwhile endeavors. Now, I know I have touched on superficially on a lot of nuanced concepts found in sociology and neuroscience that require more explanation and unpacking. Luckily, we have the experts with us tonight who can do just that. So what's in store? First, we will be hearing from Dr. Ricardo Rodrigues, pardon my Portuguese, who will be unpacking children's racial biases using insights from social psychology. Next, we will hear from Dr. Megan Carey, who will explain why we are biased using insights gleaned from neuroscience. Following this, I will be back to wrap up the presentation segment of tonight. Finally, Dr. Rolanda Evora, Dr. Joana Gonçalves de Sá, Rodrigo, and Megan will combine forces to participate in what will be the most epic roundtable discussion. Importantly, this is where you will also be able to participate in the discussion by asking your questions via the available communication channels. And now, let me introduce you to Dr. Rodrigues. So, Dr. Rodrigues. Dr. Rodrigues has a PhD in social and occupational psychology. Organizational psychology. He's an invited associate lecturer at ISTA at the University Institute of Lisbon, and he also conducts his research at the Center for Social Research and Intervention at the University Institute of Lisbon. Dr. Ricardo Rodrigues' research he's interested in looking at the intergroup relations in childhood and adolescence, and he's specifically interested in how prejudice and discrimination is developed during this period. Now, I was hearing from Mission Control that our polls were not launched, and this is a technical problem, but now we're going to launch the polls for you, and I'm kindly asking those of you who didn't do it in the registration section to please do so. And now, I'll hand over to Dr. Ricardo.
Good evening, everyone. So it's my great pleasure to be here in this our event dedicated to implicit bias. So I would like to thank the Champalimaud Foundation for inviting me. The title of my presentation is Unpacking Children's Racial Biases, Insights from Social Psychology. I should start by saying that I'm a social developmental psychologist myself, and so I'm very much interested in studying how children learn to navigate our complex social worlds. So in a way, in doing a cosmology analogy, for me, the development of the social development that children go through is a kind of a mini or nano Big Bang. So I really find quite fascinating to study how children develop to become adults. More specifically, I've been interested in studying the issue of racism in our society, in Portugal in particular, and more specifically, I'm interested in learning more about how children learn more about racism. I should say that even though today in Portugal there's an open and lively discussion about racism in our society, I still feel that children are very much away from this discussion as a focus of the discussion. So as you will see, there's a lot of research on how children learn racial biases, but I feel that they've been, in a way, left out from our public discussion. And so with this presentation today, I hope to be able to convince you that there's a lot of value in bringing the focus to children. More specifically, I will start by talking a little bit about lay people's perceptions about the prevalence of racial biases. So when we ask lay people about whether children, adolescents, adults, whether they are racist or not, what are their perceptions? Then I will move to talk a little bit about the concept, the central concept of racism and other related concepts. Then I will move to talk in more detail about what we know in regard to how children develop an understanding and their assessment also of social categories and groups in general. And then I will focus specifically on the issue of racial biases. And I will share with you some knowledge that we have also from research conducted in Portugal about the development of children's explicit and implicit racial biases. I will then conclude touching very briefly on what we know about the origins of these biases. So if I were to ask you to complete the following statement, so children are, it's very likely that the words that would come up would, in a way, convey what we can see in these pictures of children, that children are happy, friendly, they are fun, and often we say that they are actually the best that we have in our world. So it's very, very unlikely that you would complete this statement saying that children are biased, prejudiced, sexist, or racist. Actually, in order to study this more directly, we conducted a study where we asked about people's perceptions about the prevalence of racism in different age groups. So in this study, we had white Portuguese adults participating. And we asked them, so for each age group, please indicate to what extent you think white Portuguese individuals are racist. So the results show that on average, people do perceive a moderate level of racism in the Portuguese society. However, and very interesting, they do perceive lower, relatively lower levels of racism among the younger population, specifically children and adolescents. Then you might say that this can be because people are actually thinking about different generations and the idea that they might have been exposed to different ideas about social diversity. So to see if this was actually the case, we asked the second question. So now think about a typical Portuguese person, so only one person, throughout his or her life, and indicate to what extent he or she is racist. Interestingly, we found the exact same pattern. So this shows that people, in a way, believe that it takes time for people to develop racist ideas or views. Because you're participating in this event, you are aware that we asked you similar questions when registering for the conference. And so I will show you the findings when we analyzed your answers to these questions. So here I'm focusing on the attendees of our conference that said they were Portuguese nationals, that identified as white Portuguese, Portuguese white, or with European origin. Specifically, we asked you, so from a scale of 1, not at all, to 5, very strongly, how racial bias would you say that Portuguese children, adolescents, adults, seniors, and finally yourself are? So these are our findings. So here we're splitting the results by the age of the attendee in this conference, right? And so here we can see the exact same pattern. So people do perceive higher levels of racial biases the older the target is. So lower levels of perceived racial biases when thinking about children. It's also interesting to note that with age, so the older attendees in our conference, they do perceive lower levels of racial biases. So this goes down with age. And finally, and very interesting, we can see that in general, you think that yourself you have lower levels of racial biases when compared to your age group. Then we did so the same analysis, but now splitting by the gender of the attendee in our conference. And so we can find the exact same pattern. So in general, people tend to perceive lower levels of racial biases in children. And also it's interesting to note that our male attendees tend to perceive lower levels of racial biases compared to our female attendees. So then we can ask the question, why is it that people tend to perceive lower levels of racial biases when thinking of children in particular? So there are different explanations that we can put forward. So one is that actually thinking that children are racist is in a way mismatching or conflicting with the idea that children are the best. And we know that people often do not like conflicting representations. A second possible explanation is that people might think that biases actually involve some complex knowledge that children, younger children in particular, are not yet able to grasp, and also extensive social exposure and learning, which of course takes time. And then finally, it might be the case that children are indeed not biased. So people think that they are not biased because they do not see children acting out in a racist way. So now that I've tried to establish that there's this common knowledge, shared knowledge, lay knowledge that children might be less or even not biased at all compared to older people, I would like now to move on and clarify a very important notion, that is the notion of racism, and also other related concepts. So there are many definitions for racism. This is just one by Dovidio and colleagues, and they basically say that racism represents an organized system of privilege and bias that systematically disadvantages a group of people perceived to belong to a specific race. So there are three key defining elements to this definition. The first is the wrong belief, the belief that different races actually exist and can be identified based on specific physical characteristics. Then also the perception that the group has inherent characteristics like an essence which make it inferior compared to other racial groups. And finally, holding negative beliefs, attitudes, and very important, also the social power to create racial inequalities. So racism is a kind of an umbrella concept under which we can find these three dimensions. So the prejudice dimension that refers to the affective evaluation component, the stereotypes dimension that refers to people's beliefs about the characteristics of the groups, so the more cognitive aspect of racism, and then finally the discrimination dimension, so the behavioral part that incorporates then these prejudice feelings and these stereotypic beliefs. So then we might ask, where does the concept of bias falls within all this? So bias is also a very broad concept that can be defined as a relatively individual, enduring, and general evaluative response of which a person might be, and using here the metaphor of the iceberg, that people might be consciously aware of. And in this case, we talk about explicit bias, or that people might have little or no conscious awareness of. And in this case, we talk about implicit bias. So now that we've clarified these key concepts, we can ask, what about children? So how do they manage to develop an understanding of these notions, also as they grow older? More specifically, so how does children's understanding and assessment of social categories and groups develops with age? So there are quite a few models that help us think about this. And I want to share you one in particular that was proposed by Nisdale. And so this model identifies 4 key stages in children's development of an understanding of social categories. So by the age of 2, according to this model, children are under the stage 1, that is undifferentiated, meaning that they are not yet aware of social categories. By the age of 4, they move to stage 2, where they become aware of social categories, especially those that are particularly salient and visible in their surroundings in society. Then later on, around the age of 6, 7, they move to stage 3. And if they belong to a high status group, they might develop a strong identification for their group, the in-group, and also a preference for their in-group. Then later on, they might move to stage 4. So here we have a shift in their focus. They change their shift from the in-group to the out-group. And so this is basically when they might come to learn the prejudices and the stereotypes that are shared within a given society. So just to illustrate and to give you a piece of evidence that shows how this might look in practice, we conducted a study in Portugal aiming to study children's perceptions of social status. So we conducted this study with white Portuguese children, Black Portuguese children, and Roma Portuguese children. And basically we asked them to use this social status ladder to tell us what their perceptions are about the status of these 3 groups in the Portuguese society. And so this is what we learned. So the white Portuguese participants in our study are, at the age of 6, they are already aware of this hierarchy, where whites are up, Blacks are in the middle, and Roma are in the lowest position. Then the question, what are the perceptions of our Black and Roma participants? So the Black participants, the Black children, they put both white and Black up and Roma down. And the Roma participants, they put the 3 groups at the same level, but a little bit lower in this social status ladder. These results are consistent with the process by which both Black and Roma children are trying to manage a stigmatized social identity. So now that I've shown you one example that clearly shows that at the age of 6, children are already aware of these categories and the status that the different groups have in the Portuguese society, I can ask the more general question. So how do children's racial biases, so their racial evaluations, develop in the course of childhood? So to address this question, I would like first to go a little bit back in time and to talk to you about what we can find in this famous book published by Francis Abud, Children and Prejudice, where basically Abud reviewed the existing evidence looking at the development of racial prejudice in childhood. So this was published in 1988. So the expectation at the time was that exactly with age, children learn prejudice, and so prejudice might actually increase as they grow older. But what she found was actually different from this. So she found this unexpected pattern by which, or that shows that until the age of 7, 8, racial prejudice indeed increases, but then this is followed by a significant decrease. So then she asked the question, why is this actually happening? And she put forward social cognitive explanation. So basically, she proposed that with age, children become more cognitively mature, so they acquire greater cognitive flexibility that allows them to hold a less extreme view of racial groups. So you might ask, this result is a little bit dated, so 1988. Is this still the case today? And so a recent meta-analysis that was published in 2011 found the exact same pattern that you can actually see here, that is specific to high status groups, in particular white participants. So in our lab, alongside the work by other researchers in other countries, we wanted to test a different hypothesis to explain this decrease in children's racial prejudice. So an hypothesis that maybe children are not getting less prejudice with age, but maybe they have learned that it's actually not okay to show it. And so they are actually hiding it. So in this study, to test this hypothesis, we tested children with ages between 6 and 10, Portuguese white children. And in this study, we assessed both their explicit racial bias, but also their implicit racial bias. So explicit racial bias was assessed by asking children to assign positive and negative words to a black and a white target. And so then we counted the number of positive and negative words that they assigned to each. So the results showed the following. The younger participants, those with 6 and 7, so the majority of them is actually expressing a more favorable evaluation towards their in-group, so they are showing a pro-white assessment. And consistent with the pattern that was found by Abud and found also later by Rabe and Billman in their meta-analysis, we can see that with age, these pro-white assessments go down as the egalitarian assessments go up. So by the age of 9, 10, the majority of the participants is actually expressing an egalitarian equal evaluation of the both targets. So how did we then assess implicit bias? So it's quite clear that in the case of explicit bias, children can easily manage how they answer, right? So to assess their implicit bias, we used an adapted version of the implicit association test, the IAT. So specifically, children have had to classify pictures, faces of white and black children that would be presented here at the center of the computer screen, or happy and sad faces. And they had to do this as fast as they could using the keyboard. So they did this in one of two conditions. So in one condition, white was paired with sad and black was paired with happy. And in the other condition, the reverse association was presented. So here the idea is that children will show implicit biases if they are faster classifying the faces and the cartoons in this condition, where white is associated with happy and black is associated with sad, compared to the other condition. So you can see that in this specific task is very, very difficult, not to say impossible, for children to actually manage their answers so that they are able to convey that they are not biased at all. Okay, so as to the results, what did we find? Pretty much the same for the younger participants, those with 6 and 7 years old. So most of them are showing a preference for their in-group, for whites. However, and very interesting, the prevalence, this percentage does not go down with age. So the older children, the majority of them is also showing a more favorable evaluation, implicit evaluation of their in-group. So you might now ask, is this specific to Portugal? So the answer is a clear no. So we have evidence from different countries, including the US. And in this study that I'm sharing with you by Dunn and colleagues, we can see that explicit prejudice goes down with age. So in this study, they actually included adults as a comparison group, while implicit prejudice remains stable throughout age. Okay, so in this study that I've showed you, we actually gave participants the opportunity to manage their explicit answers, right? Not the case when we were assessing their racial attitudes using the IAT. So now the question is, what happens if we give children the possibility of managing their answers, but we manipulate the context? So assessing children's attitudes in a more private or in a more public setting. So if we assess children's racial attitudes using an explicit measure, but in a more private setting, or actually in a more public setting, will they actually hide that racial prejudice? So to study this, we conducted a study in Brazil with children with ages between 5 and 10. And we asked them to do this task, to distribute 13 coins by 2 targets, 1 black and 1 white child. And they were asked to do this in one of 2 conditions. So half of the participants had to distribute the 13 coins in a condition where no one was actually watching what they were doing. So the experimenter, the interviewer, was absent from the room. And children knew that once the money was inside the money boxes, no one could actually check. The other half of the participants did the same exact task, but this time with the experimenter, so a white experimenter, present and monitoring what they're doing in the room. So this is what we found. The younger children, so those with ages between 5 and 7, actually do not assign or do not differentiate the 2 targets. They assign the same number of coins to the white and black target. However, when the white experimenter is actually monitoring what they are doing, they assign more coins to the white target compared to the black target. So it seems that being in a public setting is actually activating a kind of an in-group loyalty norm that boosts the expression of racial bias. What about the older children? So what do they do? We know already from the previous studies that older children, they are likely to hide their racial biases if given this opportunity. So older children, when no one is watching, they do assign more coins to the white target compared to the black target. However, when they do the task with the white experimenter present and monitoring what they're doing, they assign the same number of coins to the black and to the white target. So they do hide their racial prejudice. So here, public exposure seems to activate this anti-discrimination norm. So in a nutshell, it seems that while younger children are learning to follow this in-group loyalty or in-group favoring norm, they do express more prejudice when someone is actually watching. Older children, they seem to have internalized that in-group loyalty norm because they do show racial prejudice when no one is watching. However, when they're being monitoring, they hide their racial prejudice. So probably they are conforming to this anti-racism norm. So now, as I'm moving towards the end of this presentation, I would still like to address one question that you might be asking. That is, what are the origins of children's racial biases? So you can see from the previous studies that social norms do play an important role. But now I would like to highlight the role of three specific sources. So one is parenting, the other is teaching, and the third one is the social structure. So in regard to parenting, there's quite a lot of evidence looking at the relationship between parents and children racial prejudice that shows that there's a moderate correlation between the two. And it's interesting to see that the correlation between parents and children's implicit assessments is actually stronger than the correlation between parents and children explicit assessments. So it seems that children are actually learning a lot from parents' nonverbal behavior compared to what they are being explicitly told by their parents. In regard to teaching, there's also evidence showing, this correlation, this influence of teachers' implicit biases, and this study by Vesali and colleagues actually shows that children are very likely to mimic the level of implicit biases that are shown by their preferred teacher, so the one that has more influence over them. And finally, there's also evidence showing that stronger implicit racial biases exist among youngsters that grew up in contexts with higher levels of racial segregation. So in order to end this presentation in a more positive note, I would like to say a few words about what we know in regard to what can be done to tackle racism in general, in issues of structural racism in particular. So there's a lot of knowledge on this, and so this is only a very tiny slice of what we know that can actually work. And so one very important thing is to promote school and community racial desegregation. So for many, many reasons, we know that this is still an issue in Portugal for many reasons, but specifically because we know that intergroup contact, and especially positive intergroup contact, is able to reduce children's racial prejudice and stereotypes. And finally, it's also very important, and this is one of the main points of my presentation, to actually open the discussion about racism so as to include children in this equation. So we can do this in many, many ways, sharing what we know about this issue as we're doing today, but more specifically, when we think about the school context, one way to do this is to include an anti-racist approach, to include this explicitly in the school curriculum. So I hope with this presentation to have been able to convince you that that racism is, of course, a problem in Portugal, so we know that already, and more specifically that if we want to tackle this issue, we need to pay more attention to how this is actually developing quite early in childhood, more specifically. So thank you so much for joining this event and for watching, of course, my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ricardo, for a wonderful talk unpacking bias from a social psychology perspective. Now we'll have bias being unpacked from a neuroscience perspective by Dr. Megan Carey. Before I go to that, though, I just want to remind you that we have chats and we have forums that you can communicate with us. I know people might be shy, but I'm also shy, and I'm here communicating with you, so I'm asking you to also talk to us. The silence is a bit deafening. But no, let's get to the perspective from neuroscience from Dr. Carey. So, Dr. Megan Carey holds a PhD in neuroscience from the University of California, San Francisco, and she's actually a principal investigator here at the Champollion Foundation. I will admit I might be a little bit biased here because Megan is also my supervisor who I enjoy working with. But for today, to tell you more about Megan, her research group here actually is interested in looking at movement, and she combines behavioral, physiological, and quantitative analyses to identify how we learn and how we move. And now I want to turn over to Dr. Megan Carey for this discussion. Megan.
Thank you, Jovan. So Ricardo just showed us some powerful examples of bias and demonstrated that it emerges early in life. But where does it come from? Why are we all biased? If we can understand that, maybe it will help us overcome our own biases. So just like everything we do, of course, bias comes from our brains. Our brains are powerful learning machines that can rapidly learn and unlearn associations between stimuli. Often this ability is helpful. It can help us make predictions about the world that are good enough based on minimal inputs. But sometimes our brains take shortcuts that take us down a wrong path. And we need the ability to recognize these erroneous shortcuts and override them when they stop being helpful and even become harmful, as is the case with the biases like the kinds Ricardo showed us. So if we can better understand where these biases come from and how they're wired into our brains, this could help us develop strategies, both as individuals and as societies, to overcome them. And so as a neuroscientist, for me, the question becomes, how can we study implicit and explicit brain processes in the lab? And for full disclosure, I need to tell you that as a neuroscientist, I won't be telling you about studies on bias specifically. Instead, I'm going to talk today about how our brains learn to control movement. You might be surprised that I'm going to try to explain brain mechanisms for cognitive functions like bias with a presentation that's based on how we basically control our arms. And I wouldn't blame you for being surprised about that. But I hope by the end of the presentation to convince you that it's actually fundamentally relevant to the brain mechanisms that underlie the kinds of biases that Ricardo presented. So our movements can in fact provide a direct, sensitive window into how our brains process information. Every action we make requires us to integrate information about the world as we perceive it, what we see, as well as integrating that together with our history of experiences that provide expectations and predictions about how the world works. And we integrate all of that information together with the state of our body and the commands that we're making to move various parts of our body in order to make appropriate movements in a busy world. Now, neuroscientists have exploited the fact that the brain's control of movement integrates all of these various kinds of signals in order to learn more about neural mechanisms for perception and cognition and action for many, many years. In the laboratory, we can manipulate sensory information that experimental subjects receive and see how the manipulations that we make as experimenters force the brain to update its predictions or models of the world. And today I'll focus on one particular example, and we'll ask together what happens if you view the world through a new lens. Now, I'll show you a movie. This is a real life experiment that we've done at the lab. The subject that you see here is Bruno, one of our PhD students, and he's going to do a very simple task. Bruno in this experiment has one job. He will see a target on the wall and he has to aim to throw a ball at the X, marks the spot. He stands 2 meters away from the wall. He concentrates very carefully and he just tries to throw the ball so that it hits the X. And you can see he does a pretty good job at this. We collect a bunch of data to see how good he is at these throws. And you can see he's not always exactly on the target, but on average, he pretty much hits the X. Now there's a motor adaptation phase where we give Bruno a pair of lab safety goggles, but these aren't normal safety goggles. They actually have lenses on the front that shift Bruno's vision. So now everything he sees appears to be to the left of where it actually is. Now when he throws, you can see that Bruno misses the X and he's actually off consistently by about 2 ticks, which is the amount of the manipulation. And the amazing thing is after just a few throws, it takes about 15 throws on average per subject, he's now able to learn, he gradually updates so that he's hitting the target perfectly. Then we can ask, what happens when Bruno takes the goggles off? So now he's just throwing, just like he was before he ever saw the goggles. How do you think he's gonna do? He's gonna hit the target right on, right? No, it turns out that he doesn't. After just 15 throws wearing those goggles, Bruno now has an error in the opposite direction. And he doesn't correct it immediately, but with practice, he eventually adjusts his throws so that now he's finally back on target. And the fact that Bruno's behavior when he was throwing without the goggles, just like he had been for his whole life, was profoundly altered by just a few minutes of experience throwing with these vision shifting goggles on, reminds us that we're constantly updating our expectations about the world in order to adjust or adapt our movements. Now, believe it or not, simple experiments like this one are used by neuroscientists every day to understand how the brain converts sensory inputs into motor outputs, and also how it learns to update its predictions about the world. So what does data from this kind of experiment look like? So here, I'll take you through exactly the steps of the experiment that you just saw in the video, and I'll show you how we convert that into data that we can use for measurements in the lab. So here's a setup. This person here is Bruno, and Bruno has the targets in front of him. And on the left-hand side is a graph where we'll plot how far to the left on the bottom or to the right of the target Bruno's throws are going. Now we care in particular about how far off he is horizontally. You may have noticed that some of Bruno's throws went a bit above the targets, but since the prisms are causing a shift, a horizontal shift in his vision, we're measuring how far off of the target he is horizontally. So we look at the first few throws before he puts the goggles on, and on average, he's right around hitting that target. And we can collect, a bunch of baseline data to see how much variability there is in the movements that Bruno makes. And there's some variability, but now, of course, when we put the goggles on, and Bruno's wearing the goggles, we see now that he makes pretty big errors because the goggles are shifting his vision, so everything appears to the left. He makes pretty big errors. And so here you see this first throw is off to the left. And gradually, not just a little bit on every throw, not all at once, he starts to hit closer and closer to the target. And now you can see if we collect lots of throws that eventually he comes back. So he's basically hitting the target almost perfectly again. Now, for the last phase of the experiment, Bruno takes the goggles off. And on that very first throw without the goggles, even though this is a behavior he's been doing his whole life, Bruno misses in the opposite direction. And this is really evidence that he hasn't just learned a different throw that he makes with the goggles on, but instead he's actually continuously updating the throws that he makes when he sees these targets on the wall. And even though he makes such a big mistake without the goggles on, it still takes him time to get back down to the normal center target hitting throws that he's been making all of his life. So there are a few interesting aspects of this form of learning that I want to highlight for you. One is that it's almost completely unconscious. Bruno's just trying to throw the ball at the X, and he may not even be aware of the fact that he's changing his behavior over the course of the experiment. And the other, of course, is that this form of motor learning is quite strong. It's so strong that it alters the way he's throwing the ball, even when he's not wearing the goggles, which again is a very familiar situation for Bruno. So this shows us that even our most basic interactions with the physical world require us to integrate our perceptions with our expectations and continuously update our models of the world. So where in the brain does this learning take place? Well, we can look at patients with damage to different areas of the brain and learn about which parts of the brain are important for this form of learning. In this particular case, we know that there's an important role for an area of the brain called the cerebellum. So the data I just showed you, we can look at is from control subjects with intact cerebella, and they show this normal pattern of motor adaptation. In patients with damage to the cerebellum, often through neurodegeneration, they still are able to throw the ball at the target, sometimes with a little bit more variation. The movements can be more variable. When they're wearing the goggles, they make those initial errors, but instead of coming back to hitting the target again, they're continue to miss the target by roughly the amount of the visual shift provided by the prisms. Then in the after effect phase, since they haven't learned to update their movements, we now see that when the goggles come off, they are just hitting the target. We don't see any of these after effects that are evidence of learned changes in the brain. So we know that this form of motor learning or motor adaptation is occurring inside the cerebellum. So how does this work? Well, when we're making movements, we're engaging many different areas of the brain. So here's a little brain schematic of a subject looking at the targets on the wall. The visual inputs, of course, come in through the eye. They go into the visual cortex, and the cerebral cortex which processes these visual inputs and generates a motor command. Now, there are fairly direct pathways that then project down to the brainstem and spinal cord that controls the muscles in your arm for making these movements. But there are also parallel pathways that go through the cerebellum. And those are depicted in schematic form here. And now these pathways that go through the cerebellum are special. They're very sensitive to errors that the subject makes. So if the ball doesn't hit the target in the way that's expected, there's an error signal that's generated that, of course, you can perceive with your eye. That visual information is then conveyed into the cerebellum. And in the cerebellum, error signals are very powerfully represented on the level of single neurons. And activity of the neurons carrying error signals actually leads to changes in the strength between these other inputs and outputs of the cerebellum. And just to show you here, in this case, any input that's active around the time that this error comes in is thought to be reduced in its strength. And then the net outcome of that is that that will make that particular movement less likely to happen in the future. And this is a general way that we think the cerebellum is continuously acting to update our movements and adapt them for changing environments. So this is a continuous process that's ongoing. And it's also something that we're really unconscious of, but it's also very powerful. And I'll show you that by highlighting what happens in a slightly different experiment. So I mentioned that this kind of learning is unconscious. It's an implicit process that we're not necessarily aware of. And this is just, again, showing you what a normal learning experiment looks like. There's an error that your brain then, through this implicit learning process, learns to correct for so that you're hitting the target again. Now, what happens? I said that this form of learning is driven by an error signal, a visual error signal. So what happens if we actually tell the subjects that they're going to experience this error? Can they actually use explicit strategies like aiming to overcome these implicit strategies or this implicit learning or not? So if we take a subject and we say, okay, your visual field, you're wearing these goggles that's shifting your visual field, and everything is going to appear to be 2 ticks to the left of where it actually is. So you should aim 2 ticks to the right if you want to hit the target. And when we tell subjects that, most of the time, if they've understood the instructions, we find that on the very first throw with the goggles, they hit the target perfectly. There's no longer any error that they need to compensate. Their behavior is optimal. But something interesting happens if we allow them to keep throwing under these conditions. Instead of continuing to hit the target perfectly, like you might expect, instead we start to see that they gradually start to hit farther and farther away from the target. And if you see this curve here, it parallels almost perfectly the learning curve that we saw in the normal experiment when the subjects are learning to compensate for the error induced by the prism goggles. So even though there's no target error, the subjects are hitting the target perfectly, they can't stop this powerful implicit learning from driving their movements away from the target. And this is because we're not always consciously aware of what it is that our brains are trying to optimize. You might think that our brains are trying to optimize how well we hit the target, but your brain also cares a lot about the relationship between what it sees and how it thinks your arm is moving. And so this is a case where the target feedback and the relationship between the visual input and the motor outputs are in conflict. And it turns out that this implicit process that's trying to match what we call a visual motor mapping between what you see and how your arm is moving is very, very strong and actually overrides this explicit instruction or this explicit strategy of simply aiming to the right to overcome the error. So implicit learning is very strong when it needs to be, but also when it shouldn't be. And so I want to take a moment to step back and think a little bit outside of the point of view of a neuroscientist and say, well, what does any of this have to do with bias? And here there are a few points I'd like to make. So first of all, like Ricardo told you earlier, what I've shown you today is that our behavior results both from implicit and explicit processes. We're often not aware of our brain's implicit assumptions, even when they're very strongly influencing our behavior. And finally, relying on implicit assumptions can lead us astray. It can cause us to make errors that are undesired. And importantly, this can happen even when we think we're compensating for them, like was the case in that last experiment where the subjects really thought they were aiming for the right target. So in some ways, this might seem sort of depressing because what I've told you is that even if you have an explicit strategy to overcome some sort of implicit bias that you might have, what I showed you is that you're just going to continue to make those mistakes and they might override your explicit strategy. But fortunately, there is some good news here. So we can ask, what happens if we allow the subjects to keep throwing even longer with the goggles on after we've given them this instruction of how they should aim? Can they learn to overcome these implicit assumptions? And in fact, they can. So this is in the case where we gave them the correct cue. I showed you that they get farther and farther away from the target. But eventually, at some point, and this takes different amounts of time for different subjects, but at some point, they suddenly start to realize that they're consistently missing the target. And when they realize that, they start to come back and now hit the target. So now they're at a point where they can finally integrate their implicit learning, their explicit aiming strategies, and also the awareness of the fact that their explicit aiming is causing them to miss the target. And now they can actually hit the target again. And one of the interesting things in these experiments is that we can ask the subjects at the end what they experienced at the different stages of the experiment. And it's very common at this stage when they stop making these errors and they start hitting the target again, for subjects to say something like, I realized at that point that the goggles had stopped working. We've even had subjects tell us that we did something. We must have done something to the goggles because they just stopped working. And you saw the goggles. These are just plastic lenses that are put on the subjects. So they're misattributing the cause of their errors, but at least now they're aware of their errors and they're able to hit the target again. So what does this tell us about how we might be able to overcome our biases? Now, first of all, I need to say that as an experimentalist who studies the neural control of movement, I'm not entirely comfortable talking so far beyond the data to try to extrapolate to talking about things like bias. On the other hand, there are a lot of fundamental things we know about learning and how the brain learns that I think are really relevant. And I think it can be extremely helpful to think about what we know about the brain in order to try to train our brains. And so the first thing that I think is clear, both from the data that Ricardo showed you and through the experiments that I presented today, is that we're all viewing the world through distorted lenses, not only when we're wearing prism goggles, but as you saw, even after the subject takes the goggles off, there still isn't a perfect relationship between what they're seeing and how they make their movements. So there's always some kind of distorted lens that we're viewing the world through, and we're often not aware of it. So our intuitions don't always accurately reflect how our cognitive biases are affecting our behavior. So we may think because we're not wearing the goggles that we have a perfectly good mapping between our sensory inputs and the motor commands that we need to make in response. But I showed you how that can change even after just a few minutes of a different exposure to a different environment. And the last thing that I think is really important is that we learn from experiments like these that actually measuring the outcomes of our behaviors instead of just sort of intuitively trying to imagine what we think the outcomes of our behaviors are. And also increasing exposure to different environments can help us first recognize and then counteract our biases. So the really critical point where the subjects who had undergone implicit learning and started going away from the target, the critical point that determined when they started hitting the target again was when they actually recognized and became aware of the errors that they were making unconsciously. And so that recognition and that awareness of our biases and of our errors is really important if we want to actively be able to counteract it. And we can only be sure that we've gotten it right by actually measuring the outcomes. And so that was all I wanted to show you today. I want to thank you for your attention, and I want to give particular thanks to the team from the Champalamo who worked very hard to help me put this together. And I want to highlight that the data and experiments that we showed you today with the PRISM goggles, these were data collected by our PhD students from the INDP program of 2014. And these experiments with PRISM goggles were inspired by similar experiments that had been done with computer tracking and mouse movements, originally by Mazzoni and Krakauer and Taylor and Ivory. And I encourage you to look at those papers if you'd like to learn more about these kinds of experiments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Megan, for your wonderful talk on bias, showing us through the lens of neuroscience. At this time, I want to remind you, the audience, again, that we are taking questions, so feel free to ask your questions. These questions will become important as we go into our panel discussion. And I also want to impress upon you that you can ask your questions in Portuguese. You know, we're trying to make this as inclusive as possible. So if you're shy because you're speaking in Portuguese, please don't be shy. So now we come to the final operation of tonight in regards to the presentations, where I will be doing a bit of a wrap-up to talk to you guys some more about bias in society. And now I will once again transform into my professional presenter self. So give me a few seconds, please, and thank you. You have heard from Ricardo how the understanding of social categories and racial biases emerged during human development. And I suspect the strength and early influences of these social forces may come as a revelation to you. You have also heard from Megan, who explained implicit and explicit brain processes and their relationship to bias. And she may have also surprised you in explaining how strong these implicit forces can be in influencing our behavior. I hope you also noticed that in both presentations, there was a message of malleability. That is, though relatively stable, biases can undergo adaptive changes. It is against this background that I wish to talk to you a bit more about the path to unbiasing. Now, we all know that humans are biased, and we also know that these biases can lead to biased decisions and outcomes. Hence, it has been argued that to eradicate these biased outcomes, humanity should aim to remove humans from the decision-making process. Luckily for us, a common solution put forward does not suggest the removal of humans full stop, nor does it support the removal of emotions from humans. Instead, it suggests turning to machines, particularly with the use of artificial intelligence or AI to overcome our decision problems. The logic goes as follows. Devoid of emotions, bias, or ulterior motives, a machine would apply cold, hard logic to arrive at optimal, unbiased decisions. However, as these things often go, there was a flaw in our logic. AI systems seek to extract relevant statistics from data to achieve a given goal in manners similar to the human brain. Indeed, many of the learning rules utilized in AI systems were inspired by brain processes. This means that, like our brains, these systems are susceptible to producing biased outcomes due to their intrinsic design, or, as is becoming increasingly apparent, due to the nature of the data they are trained on. This propensity to bias due to design flaws or improper training datasets has already been observed in multiple areas of society. And as human bias is detrimental to human well-being, so too is AI bias. Let me illustrate this with a few examples from the media and various studies. In 2018, the media outlet Reuters reported a story on an AI project Amazon launched for hiring employees. The AI was tasked with evaluating resumes and identifying the most suitable candidates for particular positions. What the company observed was, for technical positions, the algorithm was evaluating candidates in a gender-biased manner. The word woman, or coming from an all-female school led to harsher judgments. This was because the 10 years of resume data the algorithm was trained on had predominantly male participants. Hence, it learned to associate men as better candidates for these technical positions. Also in 2018, a paper was published by Bolamwini and Gabru showing disparities in the accuracy of 3 commercial facial classifying systems. Specifically, they found that the commercial classifiers had error rates ranging from 21 to 35% when classifying dark-skinned female faces. The reason for this high error rate was because at least 80% of images from 2 of the 3 data sets used to train the algorithm contained lighter-skinned subjects. Algorithmic bias has also been observed in the health sector. In 2019, a team of researchers published a study on the bias exhibited by an algorithm used by a major medical center. The algorithm sought to assign select individuals to an intensive care program based on a risk score signifying how sick they were. Particularly, Black individuals were less likely to be accepted in the program, despite having a higher number of active chronic illnesses. Note, the purple curve representing Black individuals is always above the orange curve representing white individuals. In this graph, plotting active chronic illnesses as a function of risk score. The mechanism behind the bias was revealed to be socioeconomic in nature, as the algorithm was using typical health costs to predict health need. How did this lead to bias? Despite having more illnesses on average, less money is spent on the healthcare of Black individuals when compared to white individuals. This is again evident by the purple curve now lying below the orange curve in the graph, showing mental health as a total health expenditure, as a function of chronic illness score. Importantly, the algorithm did not have race as an input, but because of systematic problems in our society, that is socioeconomic disparities between white and blacks, the outcome of the algorithm was biased on racial lines. Of course, as with the studies I went through in the case of humans, this list is not exhaustive. But overall, an increasing body of work shows the relationship between machines and bias looks like this and more like this. What we fail to appreciate in our early hopes for machine-based decision-making is that the input data to AI embodies and necessarily reflects our decision history and ultimately societal structure. As such, the output of AI systems without proper oversight serves less as an unbiasing tool and more as a well-polished mirror. Because of this, the path to unbiasing society requires improvement in both ourselves and the algorithms we design. Luckily, the mirror is a great tool for improvement as a reflection makes clear the areas that need addressing. Furthermore, the beauty of using a mirror is that changes in the observer necessarily leads to changes in the reflection. So, how do we change biases in humans and machines? The first step is increased transparency. For humans, it is important to communicate our decision processes and outcomes at both the institutional and individual level. For the machines, transparency means access or at least quality information on the design of the algorithm, training data, and outputs where possible. Increased transparency increases our chances of identifying problems in their infancy, making addressing them more manageable. This brings me to the second point for fixing biases: accountability. For humans, this means holding ourselves, friends, and others accountable by challenging ourselves and each other to be mindful of our thoughts and actions. It also means holding institutions accountable by challenging them to behave in ethical and humane ways. For machines, it means utilizing effective oversight and control mechanisms that will ensure due diligence in designing and training algorithms, redressing wrongs caused by biased algorithms, and where necessary, pulling the plugs on damaging AI projects, as Amazon did. Increased accountability encourages responsible behavior and effective problem rectification. Finally, fixing biases requires increased diversity and inclusion. For humans, this means increasing representation, particularly of minority and marginalized groups. It also means increasing opportunities for intergroup or outgroup contact, as positive interactions are reported, and exposure rather, have been reported to reduce bias attitudes. For machines, this means using more diverse training data sets and also seeking to diversify teams that design and develop these AI systems. Finally, I wish to leave you with some hope. The dream of creating a better world by reducing bias is not an impractical one. Studies have shown that prejudice habit-breaking interventions can result in long-term reductions in implicit bias. So here's to reducing bias and creating a world in which my role as a token Black guy becomes obsolete. Thank you. All right, I really hope that you enjoyed that talk and it was informative in some way. Now, I want to bring you back to the poll, which I told you was important because we have the results and they are quite interesting. So I hope you can see the results, and what it shows is more or less what people generally think. The older we get, the more biased we are, except when it comes to ourselves. And we will discuss this a bit more. And this will, of course, lead us into our panel discussion. But before I do that, I'd like to introduce my partner in crime, Rita, who is also a PhD student here at the Sean Polymore Foundation. Good night, Rita.
Hello, everyone. It's a really great pleasure to be in an event which conveys such important messages. So I would like to start by introducing our first panelist, guest panelist for today, so Yolanda Evra. and she has a PhD in social psychology, and she is a professor also at ESEG, where she is a professor for the Master in International Development and Cooperation, and she is interested in understanding how contemporary African mobilities and also Afro-descendants in Portugal, and she's also interested in understanding how the processes behind the categorization of ethno-racial minorities. So today I'll be translating for her. So bear with me as I'm not a professional translator. So I'll just briefly convey the messages to English that she'll be telling us about. Yeah, I'll pass the word to Jovin now.
All right, thank you very much, Rita. I have the task of telling us about Joanna. Joanna Gonçalves de Sá holds a PhD in systems biology. And she also has a degree in physics engineering. She is the head of the social physics and complexity group at LIP. And her group is very much interested in looking at ethical and social problems using a data-driven and a computational approach. And she usually looks at this at the intersection of biomedicine, mathematics, and behavior. Good night. And I also want to reintroduce you to Ricardo and Megan. Good night, panelists.
So yeah, now that all of our panelists are introduced, we can move on to the discussion. So it's great to have you all here. And we would like to start by going back to our poll, as you all have answered. And we would like, as Jovin mentioned, we can see that we tend to think of ourselves as less biased than our neighbor, for example. So I would like to start by directing this question to Yolanda and Joanna, and to see how this actually, this perspective reflects in the work that you're trying to do. Thank you.
Bom, boa noite. Queria cumprimentar todos. Olá. Eu estou com um pouco de dificuldade de ouvir a Rita e o Jovem, não é? Por acaso eu ia avisar ao António, não estou com um bom som aqui, não sei porquê.
Could you understand the question?
Podes repetir, por favor?
Yes. So we were
Mas
just
deixa-me pôr o...
Okay.
Onde é que está?
So I just want to know, can all the panelists hear me?
Yeah, I can, Jovan.
Okay. If you don't mind verbalizing the answer, just to be sure that everybody...
Yes.
I heard you, Ricardo.
Ok. Pode repetir, Rita, por favor.
Yes,
Obrigada.
sure. So is it better now?
Está melhor, está bem melhor.
Okay, great.
Mas é só com você e ele.
Oh, I see. Okay, I'll go slowly. Maybe that will help also with the sound. So we were looking into the poll results, right? And we think, and in general, we see that people think that themselves are less biased than your neighbor, for example, or your colleague, right? So then the rest of the people. So how do you think that this perception of the self impacts on the work that you've been developing? Yes, exactly.
Ok. Então, boa noite a todos. Queria cumprimentar aqui os colegas e agradecer à Fundação, ao António e à Laura por este convite. E novamente, como aconteceu da outra vez, pontuar para a audiência, não é? Que esta não é a minha praia, não é? E então eu achei fascinante os trabalhos que foram aqui apresentados, porque é sempre muito bom nós podermos dialogar entre pessoas que estão a ver a mesma temática sobre perspectivas diferentes.
So yeah, Yolanda is saying that it's great to have all these different specialists because it's great to have proper knowledge to discuss all these subjects. Sorry.
Então, para responder, para dar o pontapé de saída para essa questão que a Rita colocou em relação àquilo que foi apresentado e que é a temática deste nosso encontro, eu comecei logo a pensar que esses trabalhos que são apresentados nessas áreas têm essa intenção de promover alterações do comportamento, ou pelo menos da gente discutir, não é? Como fazer para promover alterações do comportamento e das funções cognitivas, não é?
So yeah, Yolanda is telling us that this is really important because we need to learn how to change our behaviors, how these actually cognitive alterations might happen, and if we learn these processes, this might make change easier.
Então, esses estudos nesse campo, não é? Referem-se com muita propriedade, não é? Às questões sobre as conexões que afetam o funcionamento cerebral, a cognição, as emoções, a personalidade, o comportamento, etc. Não é?
So these studies focus on cognition, on behavior. Can you repeat, Yolanda? Sorry.
A cognição, as emoções, a personalidade, o comportamento, acho que...
Exactly. They use personality, behavior, etc.
Uhum. Então, como é que a mente e o cérebro funcionam e como é que se influenciam?
So how do the mind and the brain influence each other?
Uhum. Então, mas eu tenho mais coisas para falar sobre isso, né, para poder chegar em como é que essas questões se conectam com a complexidade da questão estrutural que sustenta o racismo, não é?
So Yolanda has more to say about how these questions
Se conectam.
Yes, exactly. How they intertwine with each other
Com a complexidade.
To help us address. Yes.
Com a
Sorry,
complexidade.
I think I lost you, Yolanda.
I think we lost her, but I think my Portuguese is up. She was talking about structural racism as well.
Exato.
Exactly. Yeah. Thanks,
eu acho que essa é que vai ser uma discussão muito interessante se nós continuarmos a conversar entre nós, não é? Então, para responder diretamente né, aquilo que foi dado como pontapé de saída, o que eu fiquei muito interessada aqui em saber o que é que vocês acham desses resultados e desses trabalhos, quando essas pessoas não são racializadas. Porque o que me apareceu é que estamos a tratar da questão do racismo. Eu entendo que a Megan sugere, não é? Como é que isso pode ser tratado. Ela descreve aqui uma estrutura. Rita.
Yeah, so I'm having a bit of a hard time understanding, Yolanda. Could you repeat, please? I'm not
Bom,
sure
só para dar o pontapé de saída, a minha pergunta, a minha questão é como é que estamos a tratar da questão do racismo, como indicam esses estudos, como é que as pessoas que participam dos estudos...
Okay, so Yolanda is asking how, the people that participate in this study.
Yes. E que tem a ver com a questão que a pergunta que a Ruth colocou, como é que eu posso responder a isso, não é? Em relação à questão da construção do preconceito, sem falar da racialização dessas pessoas.
Okay, so Yolanda is asking how we can talk about this without talking about the racialization. I'm not sure if this is a word, sorry, of people.
And I think that there was the other element of the structural racism. So I want to be careful to make some disclaimers for, if I may just address this briefly, because I think these are really important issues that Yolanda is bringing up. And I want to make some disclaimers about the comments I made about sort of suggestions for overcoming biases, because those comments I was making are about the day-to-day biases that we all have, right? So you know, we're all biased. This is not something, you know, I'm as sexist as anybody, even though I'm a woman. And I think that's the level on which I'm talking about how we as individuals can try to improve our day-to-day behavior. But I think it's also very important to acknowledge that each of us as individuals is embedded within a society that also has, you know, because of the history, it has racism and sexism and all kinds of other isms actually embedded into its very fabric. And that is something that's much, much harder to overcome. But it's also something we see again and again with cognitive biases. And even if you just look, you know, within science, I'm active for these kinds of issues within the neuroscience community. And if you have a small selection bias at each stage in a career hierarchy, this leads to very, very large disparities once you get to the top of any kind of hierarchy. And I think of, you know, the structural aspects of these kinds of biases as being related to that, because you have, you know, even if it's a small bias, which in many cases it has not been a small bias, it's been an absolutely explicit and, you know, legally acceptable bias. But even if you're in a relatively progressive society where these biases have been minimized, they still accumulate over time in ways that lead to larger and larger disparities. And those also need to be addressed on a structural level and a societal level. It's not all about the individual.
Okay, thank you very much. If I could interject for a second here and bring Joanna into the conversation, because Megan mentioned a very important point about structural racism. And one of the things that is held in a more or less attitude that we have today is that, you know, AI will help us solve these problems of biasing. So a question directed towards you, Joanna, is how much are we already biasing AI algorithms, and how can we not input human bias into them?
Hello, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me and for everything until now. I've been learning a lot. I really like your the image that you are giving of the mirror and of the mirror of society. And I would like to push that a little bit further and say that even more than a mirror, I think we're talking about the magnifying lens. And the magnifying lens in two senses, in the sense that it allows us to see the problem and allows us really to see it at a bigger scale, and also because it amplifies the problem itself. So the way we've been training algorithms, and that's the way they are, is by using data that exists. So the algorithms are not neutral because the algorithms are made of data. And if the data is biased, the algorithms are going to be biased. So I think that we've been realizing this and we've been trying to fix them, but there are limitations to what we can do. And one of them is that we can only control and audit, like the things that you were describing, and audit the algorithms for biases that we know exist, for the list that you are presenting. Because if there are biases that we don't know as a society that we have, we cannot control for those. So we are very limited. We know that what we do is that these algorithms, they select them and they amplify them. So they make the problem worse. And the reason why is because they kind of eliminate what is seen as outliers. So if there is one, so today they were telling a joke to me, okay? So it's a concerned father, and the concerned father is saying, if all the friends of your son jump off a bridge, will you jump off the bridge as well? And the algorithm will say yes. okay, the machine learning algorithm, because that's what they do. If they eliminate the ones that are different, they eliminate the minority, the outlier, and so on, and they go with what the majority of the numbers do. So they identify the problem in a way, so it's good for us because we can see it, but it's very difficult for us to control for the ones we cannot see. So humans are biased. There's this hope that eventually we'll get to a place where we can identify these biases and train algorithms to be better, because humans are very, very biased. So the baseline is pretty poor for us to compare to when we're talking about machine learning. But the expectation that by using historical data, we'll be able to fix it, I find it concerning. But I think that the expectation that we can use this to identify biases that we have in the society structurally, and even to identify new biases that we don't know we have, I think it's a great tool for that, at least for now.
Thank you so much. That's a great answer. So actually that leads us maybe to Megan. So could you elaborate in efforts to increase diversity as a kind of undistorting of what might be our distorted lenses actually? So before biasing these actually algorithms.
I think you just asked me a question, but my internet connection is unstable, so I didn't hear the question.
I'm so sorry. I'll go again. So given what Joanna just said, that it's important to avoid biasing these algorithms. So can we think of efforts to kind of increase diversity as a kind of undistorting of what might be our distorted lenses actually?
Yeah, I mean, I think Ricardo may have more to say about this, right? But what we know in neuroscience is that if we want to unlearn something, we need to be exposed to that condition, again and again and again to unlearn it. And so this is where I think we had a bunch of discussions leading up to this event that helped Ricardo and I shape our presentations. And I think we were repeatedly struck at some of the similarities. So certainly, as a neuroscientist who studies learning, if you want to extinguish some sort of association, you have to be exposed to that situation and again and again. And I think the same is true within the sociological context.
Yeah.
Ricardo,
Thank you very much, Regan. So
Yeah.
Ricardo,
Can I jump in?
Megan, yeah, hello again. So touching on what Megan was saying, right? We have a question from the audience. As a training teacher, I would like to know how I can apply this information about children being racist or biased already at such an early stage in the classroom in an effective way. And can you recommend any practice? And I'll also ask you to touch on the poll if you have anything to say on that.
Yeah, so welcome, not welcome, but hi everyone again. It's a great pleasure to be here. And before I go to that question, let me just say that, so the issue that Yolanda raised, I think it's very important. It's a question about the origin of what we're measuring, right? So it might seem that because we're focusing on, individuals, asking kids questions, that we might have we might think that, this is a personality issue or an individual issue. I really do not believe that that is the case. So the reason why we find that, white Portuguese kids at a very young age, they are quite biased and prejudiced. This really comes from their context, from the structure of the Portuguese society. So in order to actually change that, we need to acknowledge that, I think. And I guess this, brings me now to this question that we got from the audience, right? So what can we do? So actually, there's a lot of research about what we can do in the school context, and that we know it might actually work. So one thing is to expose children quite early in their development to diversity. So diversity in teaching materials, diversity in the way we tell our history, and more specifically, how we tell our Portuguese history, you know. And we have a very biased narrative in regard to that, or we are telling just part of the story, right? So we really need to include and change the contents that we're exposing children to at a very young age. So I would say, you know, the first advice for a teacher, you know, teaching 6-year-olds would be to not to be afraid of actually raising these issues. Kids at the age of 6, they are already questioning their reality. You know, they might question, why does that kid look different from me? You know, and so they are looking for those answers. So not to be afraid of actually, you know, engaging in this discussion. Another thing that we know that actually works is contact. And this brings me back again to the structural problem. If we have a segregated society in general, you know, where the chances of people actually, you know, contacting with people different from themselves, we are really decreasing the odds of, you know, for people to actually build positive views about that diversity. And we know, actually, there's a recent study conducted in Portugal showing that there's still a lot of segregation along the lines of ethnicity and origin. And we also know that while some schools actually try to fight this segregation that exists, for example, you know, in the community, they try to fight that. For example, when making up the classes, right, they mix students. We know that other schools actually don't do this. And they go even one step further in promoting more segregation. So there's really a lot of evidence showing that if we put people together and we have, you know, positive conditions for contact between people, that will take us a long way in promoting more positive views of each other. And this is really a structural issue. This issue of, you know, so segregation is not official, it's forbidden by law. But if we look and we ask the question, right? What is the proportion of, you know, Black people, white people? And then we look at our surroundings and, you know, we will find out that for sure there are contexts that are segregated. And this is because our society is structurally racist. So yeah, I already talked a lot. Not sure if I answered the question.
Thanks a lot, Ricardo. Really interesting point of view. So we now actually have a question for Megan again, and it touches again on what we were discussing and Ricardo was also now addressing. So if you can actually turn these negative associations into positive ones, and how can this be a strategy in fighting racism, for example?
Yeah, so again, you know, from a neuroscientific perspective, you know, you certainly can change, you know, what we call the valence of whether a signal is predicting a reward or a punishment. And again, you do it through exposure. So I think, again, the answer is the same, right? That, you know, having positive experiences with people from different groups. And again, early on, I talked about how a few minutes of experience with goggles on can change things from moment to moment in adulthood. And that's true. But we also know as neuroscientists that lots of things get almost hardwired into the brain at an early age. So, you know, certainly exposure to individuals from other groups and positive experiences with those individuals from a young age is absolutely a thing that makes sense from a neuroscientific perspective. And clearly there's a lot of positive evidence for that from a sociological perspective as well.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a question here for Yolando. I'm sorry, I have a problem pronouncing your name.
Yolanda.
So I
It's
apologize.
A.
Yeah. Shamefaced. I have nothing to say. I apologize. So, should we decolonize the curriculum in Portuguese schools, especially in history? For example, you know how Portuguese discoveries are taught.
Bom, you have to ask to the Minister of Education. Mas, bom, vou falar aqui em português e responder a isso e fazendo um comentário com algumas coisas que o Ricardo e a Megan foram falando até aqui, porque eu acho que o que eles estão a trazer faz uma conexão direta faz um cruzamento, não é? Com as questões que estão ligadas a condicionamentos sociais, não é? De
So yeah,
padrões.
Yolanda is saying, sorry.
Hã?
Yolanda is saying, I'm just translating, sorry.
Não terminei
Yolanda-
a ideia.
Peço imensa desculpa, sorry.
Não, é só para dizer que foi aquilo que vocês comentaram, faz um cruzamento com questões que estão ligadas aos condicionamentos sociais de padrões e de reflexos que são socialmente influenciados, não é?
So I was translating before because it's kind of hard for me to keep track of everything, sorry. So Yolanda is saying that she will comment on this also using the information that Ricardo and Megan were providing, because it's exactly important to focus on the conditioning, the social conditioning. Was that all of it, Yolanda?
Condicionamentos sociais dos padrões e dos reflexos. Acho que isso é importante, porque tem a ver com a linguagem.
So yeah, could you repeat, sorry?
Padrões e reflexos socialmente influenciados.
The patterns and the reflexes that are socially conditioned.
Influenciados. E isto aqui é uma questão muito complexa, não é? Quando nós falamos de comportamentos ligados à questão racial. Porque, por exemplo, o trabalho que o Ricardo trouxe é que a todo momento ele ia apontando, e o que sugere é que certamente aquelas respostas seriam diferentes para crianças brancas e crianças negras ou ciganas, quer dizer, não tenho dúvida nenhuma. O que chama a atenção é que a gente pode estar a construir padrões supostamente universais para medir as questões do preconceito, etc. E sabemos que no caso da questão racial, ela não se processa da mesma maneira para grupos diferentes. Eu até gostaria que vocês comentassem, a Megan já falou um pouco, né? Mas é uma questão muito sensível, eu acho.
So Yolanda, Yolanda is basically saying that actually depending on the group that it's answering these questions, the answers might be very different. So we should take that into consideration. If you come from a minority or not.
Porque, só para terminar, só para lembrar que uma criança branca ela não é racializada, certo? E a criança negra ou cigana, romana, ela é uma criança racializada. E isso quando ela...
So there is a difference between a kid that is white, which it's not under prejudice, compared to a black kid, for example.
It's not under prejudice.
It might be different.
She's not a racialized person.
Racialized, sorry.
A racialized person.
We should be careful with the terms.
Então, o comentário que o Ricardo estava a fazer em relação à escola, é preciso pensar que para uma criança negra, a escola é o primeiro lugar, que ela não está com os pais, é o primeiro lugar do esmagamento do ego. E nós sabemos, por causa dos professores, não é? Quer dizer, eu não sei se podemos contar com os professores como o Ricardo falou assim, não sei.
So Yolanda is saying that Black kids, for example, when they go into school, it's the first time that their ego is actually under an attack, let's say.
Uhum.
So we're not sure how we can really count with the teachers here.
Mhm. Yeah. So
Okay.
can I, yeah.
Sure, go,
Um,
Ricardo.
So I fully, I think I fully get what Yolanda is saying. So my white daughter, she doesn't think about their skin color as
Uhum.
something significant. That
Claro.
doesn't exist.
Right.
She doesn't even think of herself in those terms. She doesn't question it. It's the standard.
Yeah.
And she will question, why does, that other kid has a different color? And actually, a few weeks ago, she was, asking those questions. And I know that they are not discussing this. They are not discussing this very explicitly, let's say, in her school. And so it's very, very different in terms of, the subjective processes. For example, when we ask kids, think about the status in society, and we have, those data. We see that the white kids, they are very much aware of this hierarchy, where they are actually up, right? And then the Black kids and the Roma kids, they are doing a different thing. They are managing the fact that they are different, and the fact that they are, at a very young age, at the age of 6, maybe even before that, they are already very, very aware that they value less, that there's some issue with them, and they have to find ways to manage a stigmatized identity, the fact that they are being racialized. Exactly. That's the second thing. So what about teachers? So there was also a question from the audience about, what is out there in terms of the Ministry of Education. So I think we are going through a process of opening the discussion, the debate, that is positive. But I think we are still very far from where we should be. This said, there's now this plan to fight racism in the Portuguese society. So it was open for public discussion very recently. And actually today I was, checking again the measures that they have there, specifically for the educational context. Yeah. So it's publicly available. You can do this exercise yourself. You go through the measures that they have there. So I think there are positive measures there. They talk about segregation, for example, right? So they signal that that is not okay. And so it's important to monitor, something that we've been quite afraid of actually doing, right? So there was this opportunity to ask in the census, right, this question about ethnic identification. And we did not do that yet, right? But so in the plan, there's a clear indication that we should monitor and see if we're still segregating or not. If you go through the plan, so I did this, I looked for the word teacher, and you find only 4 results. So, 4 times the word is being used in that document. And it's only to refer to the groups that were consulted in preparing this document, right? So they talk about changing the curriculum. They talk about that. Diversifying the teaching approaches, right? So it's there. But the program is very much silent about this very important actor that is, or agent, that is the teacher, right? So the teacher, we know that there's evidence on that. The teacher plays a major role. Actually, I shared a little bit of evidence, showing that if the children's preferred teacher is implicitly biased, the kid will pick up on that. So the teachers, they have a lot of power to influence children's racial attitudes. And so when you look at this plan, they seem to be a little bit out of the equation, right? So teachers, they do play a major role. Then also, a question that we should ask is, how likely it is for a Black kid in Portugal to actually be taught by a Black teacher or by a Roma teacher, for example, right? Is this likelihood out of proportion when we think about the population in Portugal? For sure it is, right? So how can we actually empower kids, right, when the chances of them actually, having a teacher teaching them, it's really, really low.
That's an important point, Ricardo. And so we want to use this opportunity now, again, leveraging what you were saying, because we have another question for Joanna, which asks, how can we leverage technology of information to aid society in reducing their biases? So just to unpack that a bit, Ricardo spoke about how, we can consider all of these, the likelihood of a student having a Black teacher. And this is from more the human side. So the question is from the side of the machines, what can we do?
So for the side of the machines, it's very easy. It's too easy. Okay, so let me try to explain what I mean. So let's say that we find that we're training an algorithm and we have this data set, and then we find that our data set is so biased that our results are biased. Okay, let's say that I give my students, and this is actually something that I typically do, they are trying to select the CEO for a company, and the data set that I give them to train on is the actual distribution of demographics of people at Silicon Valley. So then if they want to select a CEO, they always get white male. If they want to choose, they are the human resources, they have this data set they have to train. If they are trying to train for a CEO, they always get white male. If they want to train for a cleaning person, they typically get Latino woman. That's it. They don't introduce it there. They never put the ethnicity or the gender, but that's what comes out. But it's very easy to fix, right? You realize it, you see that it's there, and with one line of code, you can fix it. You can say, okay, but I want a 50-50% chance of getting this group or the other group, okay? And it's fixed. But what you are doing when you do this is a quota system, right? You're introducing a quota, and you're saying, I want 1/3 or 50% or 20%. And we've been discussing for decades whether or not we want a quota system and what are the advantages and disadvantages for different groups. And we can fix it with technology. But for me, the most important question is, should we? Or even more importantly, should a programmer that maybe is completely unaware of all of the societal discussion around it fix it with a line of code with the best possible intentions, but without all of the in-depth societal discussions that we've been having about the advantages of disadvantages? So in a way, we can think about a society by design in which we use technology to fix issues that we think should be fixed, or that some programmers think should be fixed, explicitly or implicitly, because then no one is going to go back into the code and figure out exactly what type of parameters were played with to get the results that they get. And so this type of decisions are being made. They are being made by people that are involved in big companies that have a lot of power that can interfere with what we see, with the way we interact with the world. And in most of the cases, it's not explicit that this is being done, but you can solve it. I don't know if I'm being clear. In terms of technology, you can address the issue and you can solve it. The more important question is, should we address it this way? Should we use technology to do it? And I really think that we are at the infancy of this digital revolution. So this is where we're going to be making all of the mistakes. We're going to be doing all of the horrible things that in a few years, we're going to be looking back and saying, oh my God, how did we allow this to happen? But I'm very wary of the applications of trying to fix things through these systems. But I think it's very useful that we use this macroscope to see exactly what we think should be fixed, and then we have a big societal discussion on how we should approach it. What should we be doing for all of these different issues? I don't know if this was a question.
Can I comment on that before we move on to the next question? I just wanted to say that I think that's the example is a really fascinating one. And I think it highlights, training sets are biased all of the time for these artificial systems, but also for our brains, right? Our training sets are biased. And so when, you know, I'm from the US originally, and, you know, people would say, well, I don't see race, I don't see color, right? And who says that? It's white people that say that, because they're not racialized, as Yolanda was pointing out, right? And so, you know, the first important step is to recognize that if you think you're not, you know, you're blind to these issues, it's probably because you had an incredibly biased training set. And all of these training sets for us as individuals and for all these algorithms, they're all biased.
I actually have a question. I don't know if I can, if I can pose it now, but probably for I don't know, for any of you. But is there any research on people on the autistic spectrum? So if these are social constructs, and autistic people are at least believed to have slower or different adaptation to social cues, is there research on what happens for people on the spectrum? Do they have the same implicit bias? And
so I don't know about race, but certainly for gender, there are, and this is a complicated topic, so I don't want to overreach. But people on the autism spectrum can be more blind to gender differences than other members of the population. So there's at least a trend in that direction. On the other hand, on the autism spectrum, you also have rigidity, which can lead to sort of an intensification of a decision based on minimal information. So I don't think it's 100% in one direction. I do think there are some differences.
Thank you very much, panelists. Unfortunately, as they say, all good things must come to an end, and we have to end our discussion here. So thank you, Ricardo, Yolanda, Megan, and Joanna. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you.
And this also
Thank you.
brings us to the end of our
Obrigada.
event. And I would like to also thank a few more people actually. So I'd like to thank our sign language interpreter, Tanya.
Thanks, Tanya.
We want to thank the video and graphics design team, Diogo and Tiago. You see the very lovely graphics. It was amazing. We want to thank also the art team, everybody who was behind the scene working really hard to do this.
Thank you, everyone.
And of course, we also want to thank everybody in studio here, Alex, Tiago, Beatriz, Antonio, and Andre. So thank you very much, everybody, also for joining us, the audience. This would not have been possible without you, and we hope that you enjoyed it. So here's to going out and unbiasing the world. Good night.
Good night.